I was cleaning the horse stalls when I heard the loud, angry voice echoing through our ranch. Dropping my pitchfork, I rushed outside to see what was happening. There she was, Mrs. Peterson, the head of our neighborhood HOA, along with her assistant, stomping around our property like she owned it. "This is completely unacceptable," she yelled, pointing at our newly built storage shed. "This structure violates at least 3 HOA regulations." I approached her, trying to stay calm. "Mrs. Peterson, you can't just walk onto our property without permission. This is private land." She waved a folder in my face. "I have every right to inspect violations. Your family has ignored my emails and phone calls for weeks." "That doesn't give you the right to trespass," I argued. "And that shed is on the back part of our property, well beyond HOA jurisdiction." Mrs. Peterson scoffed. "Everything in Sunny Creek Estates falls under my authority. We're documenting all violations today, and you'll be receiving significant fines." Her assistant was taking photos, wandering even deeper into our property. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Peterson had overstepped her bounds, but it was definitely the boldest move yet. Our family had purchased this small ranch specifically because most of it fell outside the HOA's reach, something we confirmed with our lawyer before buying. I tried explaining this again, but Mrs. Peterson wasn't listening. She was already heading toward our barn, her assistant trailing behind. "You can't go in there." I called after them. "That's private property." "We need to check for additional violations," she replied without even turning around. I pulled out my phone to call my parents when I heard the familiar sound of Grandpa's truck pulling up. Thank goodness. Grandpa had been the town's sheriff for 30 years before retiring. He knew how to handle difficult situations. Grandpa stepped out of his truck, adjusted his cowboy hat, and assessed the situation in seconds. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Mrs. Peterson and her assistant entering our barn. "What's happening, kiddo?" he asked calmly. I quickly explained the situation. Grandpa nodded, his face serious but not angry. "Let me handle this." He walked over to the barn, his steps measured and confident. I followed behind, curious to see how he'd resolve this. Inside, Mrs. Peterson was pointing at various farm equipment, dictating notes to her assistant about unauthorized storage and improper agricultural implements. They didn't even acknowledge our presence. "Excuse me," Grandpa said, his voice firm but polite. "You're trespassing on private property." Mrs. Peterson spun around. "Mr. Thompson, I've told your family repeatedly that the HOA has every right to—" "No ma'am you don't," Grandpa interrupted. "This barn sits entirely outside HOA boundaries. I helped survey this property myself years ago." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "The entire development is under HOA jurisdiction." Grandpa shook his head. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. And even if you weren't, proper procedure would require written notice before inspection." "We sent notices," Mrs. Peterson insisted. "About the front yard, perhaps. Not about entering structures on private property," Grandpa replied. "What you're doing is illegal trespassing." Mrs. Peterson's face turned red. "We're leaving. But expect significant fines for your violations and your disrespect." She moved toward the door, but Grandpa stepped aside and closed it. Then, with a swift motion I'd seen hundreds of times when he'd lock up the barn at night, he slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Peterson demanded, her voice rising. "Making a citizen's arrest for trespassing," Grandpa said calmly. "I've called Sheriff Davis. He'll be here shortly to sort this out. You can't do this. This is kidnapping." Mrs. Peterson shrieked, while her assistant looked terrified. "No ma'am. It's detaining individuals who unlawfully entered private property. I was sheriff in this county for 30 years. I know the law." Grandpa's voice remained steady. Mrs. Peterson pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my lawyer." "Feel free," Grandpa nodded. "Also feel free to explain to him how you entered private property without permission or a warrant." I stood there amazed at Grandpa's confidence. He winked at me and whispered, "Sometimes people need to face consequences for their actions." For 20 minutes we waited. Mrs. Peterson alternated between threats and pleas, while her assistant sat quietly on a hay bale looking embarrassed. Grandpa simply leaned against the wall, occasionally checking his watch. Mrs. Peterson paced back and forth, her designer heels clicking against the concrete floor. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I'm the president of the Sunny Creek HOA. I serve on 3 community boards. I have connections at City Hall." Grandpa wasn't impressed. "Ma'am, in my experience, people who have to tell others about their importance usually aren't as important as they think." This made her even angrier. She turned to her assistant. Write this down. We're adding harassment and intimidation to the complaint. The young assistant looked uncomfortable but dutifully wrote in her notebook. I felt sorry for her, she was clearly just doing her job. You can't possibly think you'll get away with this, Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice shrill. Locking people in a barn. It's medieval. It's barbaric. It's legal, Grandpa corrected. And temporary. Sheriff Davis is a busy man, but he's on his way. I'm calling him myself, she threatened, dialing her phone again. I know the sheriff personally. We're on the same charity committee. That's nice, Grandpa said pleasantly. I trained him myself when he was a rookie. Known him for about 30 years now. Mrs. Peterson's call connected, and we could hear her demanding immediate assistance, claiming she'd been kidnapped. Her face fell as she listened to the response. Apparently, Sheriff Davis was already on his way, responding to Grandpa's call. This is outrageous, she muttered, ending the call. Her assistant finally spoke up. Mrs. Peterson, maybe we should just wait for the sheriff? I really need to pick up my kids from school by 3. Mrs. Peterson shot her a withering look. You're not helping, Tracy. Grandpa offered Tracy a kind smile. Don't worry. This will be resolved soon and you'll make it for your kids. Mrs. Peterson wasn't done yet. She turned to me. Your family has been nothing but trouble since you moved here. That eyesore of a mailbox, the unapproved fence paint, and now this shed. The property values in Sunny Creek were perfect until your family decided to turn it into a farmyard. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to remind her that our property had been a farm long before Sunny Creek Estates existed. Grandpa caught my eye and gave a slight shake of his head. No point engaging. Finally, we heard the crunch of tires on our gravel driveway. That'll be Sheriff Davis, Grandpa said, moving to unlock the door. Sheriff Davis, Grandpa's former deputy and longtime friend, entered the barn with a tired expression. Got your call, John? What's the situation here? Mrs. Peterson immediately launched into accusations about being held against her will, but Sheriff Davis held up his hand to stop her. Let's start from the beginning, he said. Over the next 15 minutes, everyone shared their version of events. The sheriff listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Mrs. Peterson insisted the entire property fell under HOA jurisdiction, Sheriff Davis pulled out his phone and showed her the official county property maps. As you can see, ma'am, this barn sits well beyond the HOA boundary line. It's on private property that isn't subject to your regulations. Mrs. Peterson leaned in to study the map, her lips pursed. That can't be right. Our HOA documents clearly state. County records supersede HOA documents, Sheriff Davis explained patiently. According to these official records, only the front portion of the Thompson property falls within Sunny Creek Estates. The rest, including this barn and the new shed, is outside your jurisdiction. Mrs. Peterson's face fell as she realized her mistake. Now, Sheriff Davis continued, Mr. Thompson had every right to detain individuals trespassing on his property until law enforcement arrived. That's perfectly legal. So they're the ones breaking the law? I asked. Sheriff Davis nodded. Technically, yes. They committed criminal trespass by entering the property without permission and refusing to leave when asked. Mrs. Peterson's assistant looked like she might cry. I was just doing what she told me to do. Sheriff Davis turned to Mrs. Peterson. Ma'am, I'll give you 2 options. Option 1. The Thompsons press charges for trespassing, and we handle this formally through the courts. Option 2. You acknowledge your error, agree in writing that this property is outside HOA jurisdiction, and immediately cease any pending fines or complaints against the Thompsons. Mrs. Peterson looked like she'd swallowed something sour, but after a moment's hesitation, she chose option 2. Fine. I'll sign your agreement, but this isn't over. I'll be consulting with the HOA attorney about this. That's your right, Sheriff Davis said evenly. But I suggest you have him review these property maps first. Save yourself some legal fees. Right there in our barn, Sheriff Davis drew up a simple agreement on his department tablet. Mrs. Peterson read it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she scanned each line. This is too broad, she complained. I'm only agreeing that this barn is outside our jurisdiction. The agreement covers the property beyond the stone markers at the front of the property, Sheriff Davis clarified. That includes the barn, the new shed, and the back pasture. All of which are outside Sunny Creek boundaries according to county records. After another moment of hesitation, Mrs. Peterson signed it, her hands slightly shaking with anger or embarrassment, probably both. Her assistant also signed as a witness, looking relieved that this ordeal was almost over. I'll email copies to all parties, Sheriff Davis said, tapping his tablet. As they were leaving, Grandpa called out, Mrs. Peterson, next time you want to visit, just call ahead. We're always happy to have guests, when they're invited. Mrs. Peterson didn't respond, marching straight to her luxury SUV with her assistant hurrying behind. After they drove away, I turned to Grandpa in amazement. That was incredible. How did you stay so calm? Grandpa smiled and put his arm around my shoulder. When you've been in law enforcement as long as I have, you learn that staying calm usually gets better results than getting angry. Plus, he winked, I've dealt with power-hungry folks like her my entire career. Sheriff Davis stayed for a cup of coffee, catching up with Grandpa about old times. You haven't changed a bit, John, he laughed. Still handling situations your own way. The law is the law, Grandpa replied. And trespassing is trespassing, fancy clothes or not. Before leaving, Sheriff Davis warned us that Mrs. Peterson might still cause trouble. She's got influence with some folks at City Hall. Might try to find some other way to make your lives difficult. We'll be ready, Grandpa assured him. That evening at dinner, my parents couldn't believe what had happened. Dad laughed so hard he nearly choked on his mashed potatoes when Grandpa described Mrs. Peterson's face as she signed the agreement. You actually locked her in the barn? Mom asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Just detained her legally until the proper authorities arrived, Grandpa corrected with a twinkle in his eye. I've been dealing with her nonsense for months, Dad said, shaking his head. Every week it's something new, the mailbox height, the garden fence, the color of our shutters. I should have known she'd eventually cross the line. Do you think she'll cause more trouble? Mom worried. Not likely, Grandpa said confidently. People like that only push until someone pushes back. They prey on folks who don't know their rights. Well, if she comes back, I want to be here to see round two, Dad grinned, raising his glass in a toast. To Grandpa, defender of the Thompson homestead. The next morning, I half expected to see Mrs. Peterson's SUV coming up our driveway again, maybe with the HOA lawyer in tow. But the day passed quietly. Dad finished work on the shed without interruption, and our neighbor Frank even stopped by to see it. Heard about what happened with the HOA dragon, Frank said, admiring the shed. About time someone stood up to her. She fined me $200 last month because my garbage can was visible from the street. At 6:58 a.m. on collection day. Collection starts at 7 a.m. You should talk to Grandpa, I suggested. He might have some advice. Within days, it seemed everyone in the neighborhood had heard about the barn incident. Grandpa couldn't go to the local diner without someone stopping by his table to shake his hand or ask for advice about their own HOA issues. A week after the incident, a couple from the other side of Sunny Creek knocked on our door. They had been fighting with Mrs. Peterson about a small greenhouse in their backyard. We checked our property survey after hearing your story, the husband explained. Turns out our back lot line extends 15 feet further than the HOA claims. The greenhouse is totally on our property, outside their jurisdiction. Grandpa helped them draft a letter to the HOA board citing the county records and Sheriff Davis's confirmation of property boundaries. They left with renewed confidence and promised to let us know the outcome. 3 weeks passed since the incident, and we hadn't heard a peep from the HOA about our shed, our barn, or anything else. Dad even painted the shed a bright blue color that definitely wasn't on the HOA-approved color palette, just because he could. Yesterday, I saw Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store. She was examining the produce when she spotted me coming down the aisle. She quickly turned down another aisle, abandoning her shopping cart to avoid facing me. I couldn't help but smile. Word about what happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. Now, several other families were questioning the HOA's authority and checking their property boundaries. Some had even stopped paying certain disputed fees until proper documentation could be provided. At the next official HOA meeting, attendance was triple the usual number. Residents came with property surveys, county maps, and specific questions about HOA jurisdiction. When Mrs. Peterson tried to dismiss their concerns, Frank stood up and directly asked about the incident at our ranch. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Mrs. Peterson. That matter has been resolved, she said stiffly. We've clarified certain boundary issues with the Thompson property. So you admit you were wrong? Someone called out. I admit nothing, she snapped. We've simply updated our records to reflect county property lines. This wasn't the full confession people wanted, but it was enough to embolden others. One by one, residents stood up to question various HOA policies, fee structures, and enforcement actions. By the end of the meeting, a motion had passed to form a committee to review all HOA boundaries and jurisdiction claims. As for Grandpa, he'd become something of a local hero. Our neighbors kept bringing him pies and asking for advice about dealing with the HOA. He just smiled and reminded them, know your rights, stand your ground, and always stay calm. Last week, we heard that Mrs. Peterson had resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. The rumor was that enough board members had threatened to vote her out that she left before being forced out. The new president, Mr. Ramirez, had already reached out to several homeowners, including us, to reset relations and ensure fair and legal enforcement of HOA regulations. Think he'll be any better? I asked Grandpa as we fixed a fence post together. Maybe, maybe not, Grandpa replied. Power has a way of changing people. But at least he's starting with some humility, which is more than Mrs. Peterson ever had. I learned something important that day in the barn. Sometimes you need to lock a Karen in a barn to teach her about boundaries, both the property kind and the personal kind. It's not about being mean or getting revenge. It's about standing firm when you know you're right and not letting bullies push you around. Grandpa showed me that there's power in knowing the law, staying calm, and facing confrontation with confidence rather than anger. He didn't yell or threaten. He simply enforced boundaries that Mrs. Peterson had repeatedly ignored. The strongest position, he told me later, is the one where you know you're right, you can prove you're right, and you don't have to get emotional about it. This Sunday we're having a neighborhood barbecue at our ranch. Many of the Sunny Creek residents will be coming across property lines and HOA boundaries to celebrate community and new friendships forged in the aftermath of what people are now calling the Great Barn Lockdown. And you know what? Our shed is still standing exactly as we built it. Its bright blue paint catches the morning sun, a daily reminder that sometimes standing your ground is worth every moment of discomfort. Mrs. Peterson, I heard, is now focusing her energy on her garden club. Apparently they have much stricter rules about who can join than our neighborhood does, and nobody can lock her in a barn if she gets too controlling about proper rose pruning techniques. As for Grandpa, he's back to his usual routine: morning coffee at the diner, afternoon work around the ranch, and evening stories on the porch. But now his stories have a new favorite, one that starts with a trespassing HOA president and ends with justice served in a most unexpected way. It's simple, he tells anyone who asks. Know the rules, follow the rules, but don't let anyone bend the rules just because they think they have power. Real power comes from being right and standing firm. Words to live by, from the man who wasn't afraid to lock a Karen in our barn until the sheriff came.